Welcome to Farming for a Future. I'm Matthew Appleby, and today I'm with environmental journalist and author of Regenesis, George Monbiot, and I'm interviewing him on behalf of the Vegan Organic Network. So, I mean, I guess what my sort of big question is, like, what Tolly does, his growing operation, how could you multiply it in the UK? Do you think it's replicable? You know, why aren't there more of them?
Yeah, well, I mean, what he's doing is fantastic. It's really groundbreaking. Quite amazing how he's managed to raise fertility and yield without fertilizers or manure over the course of 34 years. But it is very tough. You know, he has to devote enormous amounts of time and effort to something which pays very little. I mean, it's he makes remarkably little money from this really brilliant and innovative work. I mean, as we know, horticulture is a tough business to be in for everyone, and his model is quite labour dependent. I mean, not much more labour intense than other horticultural models, but you know, you're constantly up against the really low prices for veg, which is coming from Dutch greenhouses and Spanish polytunnels and stuff, and that makes it very hard. Some people have been able to replicate what he's doing, and have done so pretty successfully. And I know several growers who, see his approach as the gold standard, which they're trying to emulate. But some haven't been able to make it work, and we're not sure why. I mean, what Tolly is doing is clearly engaging with soil biology in a really innovative and interesting way. He seems, in fact, to have anticipated recent developments in soil ecology by quite a few years. But it could be that these techniques work on some soils and not others, or perhaps on other soils they need to be tweaked in certain ways that we haven't yet fully come to terms with. I think the problem is that we just know so little about soil. It's almost a black box to us, and there's been so little money put into discovering how this most crucial of all ecosystems works, and how we can get more food out of it with less farming, with less damage, with less intensity, but high yields, which is absolutely essential.
No, indeed. I mean, I was listening to the Oxford Real Farming Conference the other day, and Tolly was on that, as were Delftland organic veg growers, and they were talking about using peat and or vermiculite for propagation, and they were talking about how there isn't the substitutes available to sort of to propagate young block veg. Have you got any views on that, or any sort of insight into that?
Well, I've seen Tolly's operation producing their own propagation medium through using the fine grain from wood chip and mixing that with vermiculite, which has definitely got to be better than peat by quite a long way. I mean, peat is about the worst substance you can use. But when I was working with him, he was about halfway through the experiments and looking at ways of compacting it to create the blocks which make it a bit easier to use. But it seemed to be going well, and it looked like a good substitute. But I'm not quite sure what the state of play is at the moment. Having been to his talk, you're probably more up to date than I am.
No, well, there's certainly a lot of work in that area going on, like you say. Just looking more generally, I mean, can you sum up what role you think stock-free farming and organic food production plays in being part of the solution to the environmental crisis?
Yeah. So the most damaging industry on earth is the livestock industry. It's the major cause of habitat destruction, deforestation, of wildlife loss, of species extinction, and one of the major causes of climate breakdown, of water pollution, of air pollution, and it is by far and away the biggest cause of land use, which should be one of our top environmental priorities, because every hectare of land you use for human activities is a hectare of land which can't be occupied by wild ecosystems such as forests, wetlands, savannas, and the rest. And so freeing ourselves from livestock-based production is an absolutely essential environmental task. It's as important, if not more important, than leaving fossil fuels in the ground. But it's one that's been greatly neglected by policymakers. Now, one of the repeated themes you hear is, well, we need to use animals in order to support arable and horticultural production. We need their manure. Now, as it happens, animal manure is actually not a great soil amendment, and its role has been greatly, its benefits have been greatly exaggerated. The fundamental problem is that its nutrient release is out of sync with the nutrient demand curve of crop plants. So the demand curve obviously starts at 0 before you plant your grain or your seed, and then it rises pretty steeply during the major growth phase, and then it tails off quite sharply. If you're looking at cereal crops, for instance, there's no nutrient demand at all by the time the crop is drying off, and we're getting to the end of the ripening period. And then, of course, when it's harvested, there's no nutrient demand. But the trouble with manure is that it's very slow release, which means you have to apply it to the land before you plant your seed, whereupon it's already releasing nutrients, including a lot of nitrates, and then it continues to release fairly steadily through the period of plant growth, with generally not meeting the nutrient demands of the plant. And then after the plant has ceased to need nutrients and has been harvested, it continues to release the nitrates and the other minerals. And the result of this, quite shockingly, is that animal manure is responsible for more nitrate pollution than per unit used than artificial fertilizers. Now, artificial fertilizers are bad enough, and they're generally too fast, whereas animal manure is too slow. But when you compare the two of them, manure is even worse. And so this whole idea that we're closing the nutrient loop by integrating cropping with animal production, it just does not stand up. And fairly shockingly, when you investigate how on earth these systems can be sustained, you find some pretty uncomfortable facts, really, because the whole idea of organic production is that you're meant to be closing the nutrient loop. You're not meant to be leaching nitrates and other minerals into the ecosystem. But obviously, you can't sustain levels which are around a third higher than the massive losses you get from artificial fertilizers. So manure is about a third higher than those huge losses. How do you do it? How do you ensure you retain enough nitrates in the soil? Well, mainstream Soil Association organic guidelines allow you to buy in manure from conventional livestock farmers. So in other words, you can use artificial nitrogen as long as it's been through someone's animals first. It makes no sense at all. It's a really crazy way of trying to square that circle. And so what Tolly and other veganic growers are doing is really cutting out that highly dysfunctional system and making use of the wonders of soil biology and the ability of microbes in the soil, both to immobilize and to mineralize. In other words, to lock up nutrients when they're not required and to release those nutrients when they are required. And what Tolly has done over the course of 34 years is to experiment with that, even if it wasn't always clear to him that that's what he was doing. Through endless trial and error, he seems to have found a way of making that happen and of ensuring you retain your nutrients. You keep your nutrients in the ground, you release them only when they're required by the plant, and you don't release any more than the plant needs.
No, indeed. Now, he's been sort of fundamental in introducing stock-free standards, including limits on the amount of plant material a farm can import. Do you think that's important? I know Tolly does, and in the stock-free standard system, it is important too.
Yes, I mean he emphasises very strongly the issue of ghost acres, of of not using off-farm resources and sucking nutrients out of other systems. And I think this is a very important principle. The problem with some other organic systems is that they do rely on imported nutrients to quite a striking degree. And one of those, for instance, is no-dig farming, which has got certain virtues, undoubtedly. But if you're going to do it on any sort of scale, you need to be bringing in an awful lot of organic material. Whether it's green or brown, that material, the amount you need to pile up on top of the soil in order to pursue your no-dig system is going to require a lot of off-plot nutrient harvesting. Now, I say off-plot because it could be that, if you're doing it in your garden, you've got a lawn and you're using the grass cuttings and you're finding other sources within your own land. But of course, if you're doing it on any significant scale, you're almost certainly going to be bringing in those nutrient sources from elsewhere. And so you're robbing Peter to pay Paul. You're taking away nutrients from one place and concentrating them in another. And as Tolly himself has found, because he often gets called in as a consultant, and sometimes he gets called in as a consultant by no-dig systems which have gone wrong, they work pretty well in the first few years, but after a while you have such a build-up of nutrients that you're more or less creating a peat bog, and it becomes actually quite inhospitable to crop plant growth.
No, I was going to ask you about no-dig because it has become the norm, but I don't think it's fully understood, and the whole sort of organic growing thing is I don't think is properly understood yet. So how do you get the message out there? And also, what was your sort of moment of revelation? How did you come across all this?
Well, I must say, when I first heard about Tolly, I didn't really believe it. I just thought it was impossible, because you hear a lot of claims, particularly in food production. There's a load of wild claims about productivity and about techniques which often feel this can't possibly be true. And when you investigate them, 99 times out of 100, they're not true. There's a huge amount of exaggeration, and we like to believe these fables. The Bible is full of stories of making food out of nothing. It's feeding the 5,000. It's the widow's oil and bread. It's Elijah fed by the ravens, and all the rest of it. Manna from heaven. All of this stuff. We love these stories, and so we've got to be very cautious when we come across such stories, and ask always, is this really true? And most of the time, it's not. So I was pretty shocked to discover that what Tolly's claims really did seem to stand up. And as I investigated them further, and I returned on many occasions to see what he was doing, looked at the figures, and it stands up. It does actually work. So it was quite a surprise. I mean, I'm a very skeptical person. I've got a scientific background. I try to ensure that the data is always there, that you can back up any claim with figures. And one of my great complaints about popular coverage of food issues is food innumeracies, that people talk in pictures, but they just aren't across the numbers at all. And one of the things that impresses me so much about Tolly is that he is a great natural scientist. When I said this to him, he was really quite shocked, because he said, well, I haven't got any education. I left school when I was 15. But he really sort of intuitively grasped the scientific principles. He's got meticulous data keeping, records going back throughout his entire period. He keeps weather records, all the other changes in environmental conditions. And he also, throughout this period, has just changed one variable at a time, so that you know what you're measuring, and you know what you're changing, and you know what might be working or what might not be working. And through his rigorous record keeping and the way in which he's enhanced his practice year on year through these rigorous experimental approaches that he uses, he's managed to pull it off, and he's done something which would have seemed impossible if I didn't see it with my own eyes.
No, brilliant. Another thing I want to ask you is what role does your own health have in what you research? I'm thinking about sort of wood burners and asthma, that type of thing. How important is that for you in terms of what you're looking into?
Well, one thing I constantly remind myself of is that I'm not statistically significant. None of us are statistically significant. We're all just, when it comes to epidemiology, when it comes to any form of research, you need to do it under huge numbers, and you can't really draw many conclusions from your own health. But there's no doubt that certain things do us in, and sometimes you can actually feel it. And so with wood burners, I installed wood burners. I thought it was a great idea, and I began to feel the impacts it had on my asthma. It made it considerably worse, especially every time I opened a stove door to refuel, and later discovered that actually they're really very bad indeed for our health. Another thing which people don't want to hear, but unfortunately is true. With nutrition, obviously, it's harder to make direct links between what you're eating and what your health is, because these are long-term impacts. It can take years for the impacts of your diet to manifest in health conditions, be they diabetes or bowel cancer or whatever it might be. But there is a great deal now of epidemiological research showing what a healthy diet looks like. And it's very different from the mainstream diet. Now, I became vegan as a result of being persuaded of the enormous harm that animal agriculture was doing. But I see that there is also some pretty powerful evidence that it's better for your health than a mainstream British diet is.
No, I don't think anybody on this who's listened to this would disagree. So, what would you say as an overarching question? What is your sort of vision for agriculture? What do you see the future as?
Yeah, so I think we have to divide agriculture into three. I think it's a mistake to see it as one monolithic entity. And so I think that grain growing, horticulture, and livestock production have been pretty well separated in most agricultural forms, and actually operate under quite different economic and agronomic principles, and they require different solutions, and they all need solutions because they've all become very dangerous in planetary terms. I mean, both in terms of the enormous environmental damage being done, and in terms of the unsustainability of production models, which threatens our future sustenance. And so, these two great questions, how do we feed the world and how do we do it without devouring the planet, should be occupying us all the time. These are absolutely crucial and existential questions we should be attending to. So
you split the UK and the rest of the world when you're talking about that?
I mean, broadly, we're looking at similar constraints worldwide. It's issues like how much land is being used, how much water is being used, how much fertilizer is being used. These, partly because of global standardization of agricultural techniques, these are fairly consistent questions that you can apply to almost any place. But obviously, there remain considerable differences, particularly between tropical and temperate nations. But these principles can be applied in different ways in different places. So with horticulture, I mean, there are a range of really interesting and innovative techniques, but I have to admit the one that excites me most is the veganic approach. I think it's got enormous potential, and if we can only understand soil a bit better, it's got that potential to be rolled out much more widely. With grain production, we have got enormous problems here, both because mainstream grain production is highly damaging to soil, relies on a massive over-application of fertilizer and in many parts of the world of irrigation water as well, both of which are being used at completely unsustainable rates. Ploughing is breaking down soil structure to a terrifying extent, but also grain production is highly susceptible to disruption by climate breakdown. And there are several of the world's major grain growing regions, which it's very hard to see them coming through the 21st century unless something changes drastically. So I've become particularly interested in perennial grain crops here, being developed, among others, by the Land Institute in Kansas, which has been scouring the world alongside other academic groups to find candidates for perennial grain cultivation. And they've got one fully commercialized breed, which is a perennial rice crop, now producing the same yields as annual rice, but without requiring the annual ploughing and planting, which causes such terrible soil erosion. And that's become very popular now in southern China, not least because it cuts labor costs considerably. But they're working on a whole series of other grain crops, wheat and barley and substitutes for wheat, sunflowers, lots of other potential legumes as well. And what we're looking at here is the possibility greatly of reducing the need to plough, the need to fertilize, the need to apply herbicides and pesticides, the need to irrigate. These are plants with much deeper roots, much tougher structures. They're likely to acquire more resistance than an annual plant can in the course of its short growth period. But they're also likely to be far more environmentally resilient because of their deep roots and because of their tougher structures. They'll be able to get through droughts, for instance, that annual crops would struggle with. So those are two of the approaches, one in horticulture, one in grain, in arable production. But I think the most important issue of all is livestock, because this is the industry above all others that threatens our time on Earth and that of many, many other species. And I believe we should seek to get out of livestock production altogether. Just as we should be leaving fossil fuels in the ground, we should be stopping the farming of animals. And we have the potential now to do so in a way which I think could be transformative. And this is that we can start farming single-celled organisms as opposed to multicellular organisms. The principle is very similar. You know, we've bred these multicellular organisms called animals to be grown as efficiently as possible with terrible costs for their welfare and terrible environmental costs. But with single-celled animals, single-celled organisms, which we haven't even started breeding properly, we can, once we start developing these techniques of precision fermentation, we can massively reduce the land footprint, the water footprint, the nutrient footprint, shrink to a dot the amount of resources required to produce protein-rich and fat-rich foods. And this enables us potentially to do two things. One is to release huge tracts of the planet from the impact of livestock farming, and to rewild those enormous areas of land, bring back the forests, bring back the wetlands, the savannas, the grasslands, give land back to the indigenous people who were thrown off by cattle ranching and these other disastrous impacts of animal farming, and draw down very large amounts of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere as ecosystems recover. And the second is massively to enhance global food security, because many nations now have become entirely dependent on imports from places thousands of miles away. And those imports are becoming ever more precarious as environmental change hits food growing regions, but also as geopolitical disruptions, such as the war in Ukraine, and the fact that so much food is now channeled through critical choke points like the Suez Canal, Turkish Straits, Straits of Hormuz, Panama Canal, and the rest of it, which are becoming increasingly vulnerable. Many nations are now trapped in this extreme import dependency. But because you can breed microbes anywhere, and all you need as your feedstock is sunlight, because some of these microbes eat hydrogen or methanol, then countries can release themselves from that dependency, greatly enhance their food security and their food sovereignty, and generate genuine local food networks.
But there's a bit of criticism that giant corporations might take over that type of business. Does that worry you?
Oh, yes, that definitely worries me. So the starting position is that giant corporations have already taken over most of these businesses. For instance, 90% of the global grain trade is controlled by 4 corporations, and this is disastrous. It allows countries to be held to ransom. It gives these companies enormous power. But the answer is not to ban the global grain trade, because if you did that, billions would instantly starve. It's to break up the giant corporations and to prevent them from acquiring such dominant positions. And the same applies to new food technologies. The answer is not to scrap the technologies, which have this tremendous environmental and humanitarian potential. It's to ensure that they can't be captured and concentrated by a few corporations. And for that, we require something we need right across all commercial sectors, which is strong antitrust laws and weak intellectual property rights. There should be no ownership of life of any kind. No life form or part of a life form, a gene, a cell, anything like that, should be subject to a patent. Maybe certain processes can be patented, but those patents should be weak. And there should be measures such as compulsory purchasing, so that compulsory licensing, so that poorer nations can make use of those technologies without having to pay big fees. And antitrust laws should be strong. We should be breaking up big corporations. There shouldn't be an Amazon. There shouldn't be a Google. There shouldn't be a Cargill. We should be breaking them up and distributing them. And what we need in all cases is a redistribution of production. And what precision fermentation, the brewing of microorganisms, has is the enormous potential to be done in a distributed fashion. I mean, the problem with a lot of our food production at the moment is that we rely on distant places for simple mathematical reasons. We live in concentrated places. We live in cities, so the majority of the world's population, and most of those cities do not have a sufficient agricultural hinterland to feed them. So they have to import food from far away. In fact, there was a study published, I think, in Nature Food, which showed that the minimum average distance over which the world's people can be fed is 2,200 kilometers. And that tends necessarily towards concentration and towards vulnerability as well. But with precision fermentation, you can do it on your doorstep, wherever you are and whoever you are. You can have microbreweries in every town, just like in some towns we have microbreweries making beer. You have microbreweries producing protein-rich foods tailored to local markets. Why not? But and so it has the potential for distribution that mainstream food production does not have. But that potential can only be realized if we prevent big corporations from becoming dominant. So, what we should be fighting is not the technology itself, but the question of who owns that technology and who profits from it.
Great, thanks, George. I've just got a few more questions. What are your political hopes? I mean, it might be a change of government. We were just talking earlier on about Kerry McCarthy, who's kind of on side agroecology, in a potential future Labour government. So do you think they could help with the sort of breaking up the corporations, or even promoting sort of vegan farming at all?
Yeah, I mean, Kerry McCarthy's great. I wish she was Shadow Environment Secretary, as she once was. She really gets it. And she was one of the few recognisable Labour Shadow Environment Secretaries. I play this game, no disrespect to the current incumbent. He's all right, but I play this game. I ask environmentalists, who is the Shadow Environment Secretary? And most of the time, it's like, do you know? Could you answer that question?
Well, I interviewed Daniel Zeitner the other day, and I thought he was, and he wasn't, because he's a junior minister, the same as Kerry McCarthy. Yeah.
It's Jim McMahon, and he's not a bad guy. You know, I think he's all right, but yeah, where's the profile? You know, this should be seen as one of the great offices of state. You know, he should be everywhere. Everyone should know what he thinks and what he's saying. But we've had shadow environment secretary after shadow environment secretary who just hasn't figured. And one of the few who did was Kerry McCarthy. So there's potential there. I mean, Starmer's a bit of a black box. It's really, you know, hard to know what he's thinking a lot of the time. He's, you know, they're very keen to keep their powder dry. And the problem is that, you know, you keep your powder dry for too long and the battle's over before you've fired a shot, you know, to extend that military analogy. It's got to be better than the current lot. You know, the current lot are in hock to the worst agricultural interests. In fact, just today, we had George Eustice, the former Conservative Environment Secretary, calling for vegetable oil to be used to heat homes. Now, we've had a total catastrophe with the renewable transport fuel obligation using vegetable oil to power cars and trucks, mostly palm oil, but also soya, rapeseed oil, and competing directly with people for food while also driving environmental destruction. And in fact, when you look at the total environmental costs, it's even worse than fossil fuel. And now he wants to use it to heat people's homes. The only reason I can think of why he would come up with such a direct, dumb, stupid idea is agricultural lobbying, you know, creating upward pressure on vegetable oil prices, which is exactly what people in food poverty do not need.
No, indeed. There's been some shockers in the past, but thinking of lobbying and Owen Patterson. But anyway, moving on. To sort of sum up, you know, how can we change the current system, and what lifestyle choices would you like to see people make?
So the most important thing we can do as individuals is to change our diets. You know, that is the number one top shift that we can make, which would reduce our environmental impacts. And changing your diet from an animal-based to a plant-based diet, that's the biggest and the best environmental thing you can do of all, bar none. Second to that comes stop flying. But we shouldn't just act as individuals. You know, we should be citizens first and consumers second. You know, we're constantly told we're consumers and we should make changes through our consumer choices. Now, I'm not saying that's unimportant, but it's not as important as what we do collectively. Most importantly, it's getting together, it's protesting, it's demanding change, it's coming up with better ideas for how the country should be run, for how the world should be run, for how we do things, and then turning those into political demands. And hopefully, if we get a sympathetic government, turning those into policy. And so I've always been a direct activist. I'll always continue to be a direct activist. You know, from time to time, I'll be arrested for direct action because I recognize that direct action is the lifeblood of democracy. All our freedoms arise from it. And if we're going to get through this century and the centuries that follow, it will be in large part because of popular protest.
Very lastly, I just wanted to ask you a fun question, George. What's your favorite plant-based recipe?
Oh, that's a good one. Okay, there's a really nice squash and tofu stew by Anna Jones, a recipe of hers. Well, it's a sort of soup, a sort of stew with green peppercorns, coconut, unfortunately, and coconut turns out to be pretty damaging. So I've got to find a way of substituting that from it. But it's really delicious. It's got lemongrass in, it's got kaffir lime leaves in, it's got a fair bit of chili, lots of garlic, lots of ginger. And it's a great winter warmer, but also it's very rich and subtle flavors when you put it all together. So yeah, that, but I would tweak it a little bit.
Would you grow any of that yourself?
Well, I used to have 5 allotments and I grew a lot of food, and including squashes, not the kaffir lime leaves or the lemongrass, but Though when I had a polytunnel, maybe I could have made a stab at that, but probably they would have got wiped out in the harder winters. But yeah, I used to grow a lot. At the moment, we're living in a rented house, and I don't have any land, so and I don't have much time at present. But I hope to get back to it at some point.
Brilliant. All right. Well, it's been fantastic talking to you, George, and thank you for all your time there and your very detailed and brilliant answers. And I hope the book Regenesis carries on reaching a wider audience, because I guess that's the aim. We don't want to sort of have it going out to people who are the converted. It's got to go out to people who need to understand all about it.
Right.
But yeah. Thank
Lovely
you very much.
And sorry about the late start.
No worries at all. It's been brilliant speaking to you. Thank you very much.
Very unprofessional of me. Okay, take care then. Cheers.
Thanks a
Bye-bye.
lot. See you soon. Bye.
Yeah.